The English Bible I normally use is rather old. In fact, it's had to be rebound. Strangely, since I teach the New Testament rather than the Old Testament, it's an Old Testament page that kept falling out of my Bible. The offending page contained Genesis 12, which is one of the passages for today's devotional. You see, Genesis 12, 1-3 is a pretty important passage. The first couple of chapters of Genesis tell us that God created a good world. In fact, it tells us that God made the world very good. And then in Genesis 3-11, we hear about everything that's gone wrong. We hear about the entry of sin and death into the world and about all the implications of that in terms of family and society and just about every dimension of human life being affected by sin and death. Genesis 12 is the beginning of a new chapter in the story. Genesis 12, 1-3 is about the call of Abraham and Sarah. Abraham is important not just because he's an Old Testament figure among any other Old Testament figures. Abraham is the father of Israel, the beginning of God's new people, and the beginning of God's solution to the world, to the problems of the world. Genesis 12, verse 3 is very specific about what this means. Abraham and Sarah are not chosen by God for themselves alone, but for the sake of all the nations of the world. Through you, God says to Abraham, all the families of the earth will be blessed. One of my teachers used to say, God so loved the world that he chose Abraham. God's mission in the world involves this family, which becomes this nation, Israel. God did not choose Abraham for Abraham's sake, and he didn't choose Israel for Israel's sake alone. God chose Israel for the sake of all the nations of the world, for the whole creation. Putting words into God's mouth, this ancient Jewish tradition has God say, I will make Adam, and if Adam goes wrong, I will send Abraham to make things right. So the story of Abraham and Sarah is the beginning of a new chapter in God's story with the world. But you may ask, if God chose Abraham for the salvation of the world, then why do we need Jesus? It's a good question, actually. And the answer is straightforward. Abraham and Sarah, although chosen by God, also share in the sin of Adam and Eve. Abraham's family was chosen so that the nations would be saved, but Abraham's family itself needs salvation. Abraham's family itself needs to be rescued. Israel's exodus from slavery in Egypt is probably the best illustration of all this, of Israel's need and of God's deliverance of his people. The subsequent history of Israel in the Promised Land continues the story of Israel's imperfect witness to their redeeming God. Israel was not only a witness to a merciful God, but also a witness to a people in need of mercy. In the end, the nation of Israel, God's beloved son, and by the way, Exodus 4 and Hosea 11 both call Israel God's son. The nation of Israel, God's beloved son, is inadequate to the task of blessing the nations. Another son is needed, one who shares Abraham's human heritage, but not Israel's sinful nature. And so God does send Abraham to make things right, or rather, Abraham's child, the Lord Jesus. God so loved the world that he sent his son, John 3 tells us, the true and perfect and sinless Israelite, so that all who put their trust in him would be rescued.